Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I need to call out an egregious crime against sword information in an otherwise brilliant film, The 13th Warrior. And it is in regards to Viking swords, or Viking period swords, and scimitars. So, in The 13th Warrior, a man from the Middle East ends up traveling with some Vikings on a quest. Still, great film. Love it. And in the film, he is given a sword. They throw him a sword, and as he grabs it, he says, I can't remember the exact words, I can barely lift this, or I cannot lift this.
Here. You'll need this.
I cannot lift this.
Grow stronger.
And the response of the Scandinavian, gentleman says, grow stronger. All right. First thing. Are Viking period swords really that heavy? Okay, see, this is the thing. It's not just this type of thing in 13th Warrior, it's actually the general sentiment of this that pops up in multiple videos, that European-style swords, whether earlier, medieval, if you want to, include that medieval period dates as when it begins, that's a debate. But anyway, if you want to include them, but still, Viking swords in particular usually get a bad rap for being heavy, as well as just medieval swords generally. And with the popularity of 13th Warrior, I actually suspect that that film might be responsible for a decent amount of the misconceptions or misunderstandings of the weight of medieval swords, but not just that film as well. I think it just contributed to it significantly. So, let's actually compare and contrast the real weights of these swords. I have two examples of a Viking period or style sword, and two examples of the stereotypical term is scimitar. They're actually shamshears. And once we compare the weight, there is another scene in the film that we do need to address in regards to the maneuverability, how effective they are, their cutting capacity, and you might know the scene I'm talking about if you're also familiar with the film. So, of course, swords do exist on a bit of a spectrum. Not every sword is going to weigh the same as other ones. For instance, this Honshu, it's a kind of tactical one. I really like everything about this sword, probably except the tactical grip. And there is a potential issue with the attachment method for the pommel. We're going to have a full dedicated review on both of these Honshu Viking period swords. It might be out before or after this video. But if it's not, subscribe so you get to see the details of these. There's a lot to like about it. There's also a lot to comment on, and you don't want to miss out. And there's a lot of people who watch the content, you haven't subscribed, but if you're here, you probably like the content, and you need to check on that bell notification. Also, there's a setting on the bell notification where you get to say, basically, alert me for everything, not just what you pick. So you need to go the extra measure if you want to get notified for everything, but do subscribe so you don't miss out. So, this Honshu Viking sword comes in at 1.2 kilos. This is a gorgeous weight. And by the way, in terms of maneuverability, this thing, gorgeous, right? A bit of a contrast, wouldn't you say, to a sword that a grown man cannot lift at all, right? And can barely swing around. Like, they exaggerate that so much in the film. Now, having said that, there are lighter and heavier versions of the shamshear. This one, which comes to us via Cult of Athena, is a gorgeous cutting sword. We do have a full review on this one, and it weighs in at 0.7 kilos. So yes, it is much, much lighter than this Viking period sword, but the Viking period sword is nowhere near so heavy that you could barely lift it. But also, this is just one example of a style of shamshear. Have a look at this one, also by way of Cult of Athena. Chunkier blade, more authority, and let's have a look at the weight. Wouldn't you know it? 1.2 kilos. The exact same weight as this Viking period sword. So, like, it's just kind of comical that they depict the Viking sword as so heavy he couldn't even lift it. Now, of course, having said that, well, I've already said that swords do exist on a spectrum, and so This is the historic forge, Hodenshu. It is a dirty... We need to wipe this blade. Where is a cloth? We are wiping this blade. There we go, looking much cleaner. Now, this is the historic forge Hodenshu Viking sword. And the reason why Viking sword is a complicated name for these style swords, it wasn't just the Viking using this style of sword, but it's associated with the Vikings so much they call it Viking sword. It's more the Viking period sword, but not just Viking. Anyway, so this one, 1.48 kilos, much more weighty. So effectively 1.5 kilos, but I prefer to call these swords the Sverd, which just is, you know, Old Norse for sword. And by the way, it's a common practice to call swords by the name sword in another language. Katana actually translates to sword. And there's a couple of other ones. But okay, 1.5 kilos, much weightier, right? And yes, heavier than the two Shamshirs here, but by no means not, you know, so heavy that you can't lift it. This will have more authority in the cut. You'd really be able to get some power behind it, but nowhere near as bad as what the 13th Warrior depicts. So the next scene I want to comment on is when Antonio Banderas has his Viking period sword, his Sverd, and he's trying to use it and he can barely lift up and is swinging it around like he can barely wield it. This is unfortunately comically dumb, because later they show that he knows how to use a sword, okay, when he literally it's not really reforging. I don't remember him putting in the heat, but it's on a grinding stone and he like grinds it into a curved sword, taking off a decent chunk of weight, but maybe he did reforge it, okay. But when he does that, and he has a, you know, effectively Shamshir in his hand, he's suddenly really proficient. And it's like, no. If you're proficient with a Shamshir, you're going to be able to use a Sverd pretty decently, all right? So the fact that he can barely use the Sverd in the film indicates that it's primarily due to the insane excessive weight of the sword.
Stand there. I cut this pole. So. How you doing?
Bonkers, all right? This is a profound, or they can be profoundly light and nimble swords. Like this one here, right, is beautiful, maneuverable, 1.2 kilos. You can have heavier ones, still maneuverable, usable enough. Then we come to cutting capacity. So here's the thing. Having reviewed this Shamshir on the bottom here, it is a really good cutter, okay? In fact, it was surprisingly good because it's utilizing a more aggressive curve, which does enhance cutting capacity. That is a much steeper curve than what you'd say find on a katana or messer or things like that. It does actually make these swords pretty aggressive cutters. It's not to say that Viking period swords are not crazy good cutters either. They are. And the contrast that they show in the film where he could barely even hit the pike or bit of wood that he was aiming at, but then he chops through a thick branch. We're talking about like at least tennis ball diameter thick, right? With a Shamshir style blade, because it was a Viking period sword. That one I gotta press exit because it's annoying that they over-exaggerate in one extreme the weight of this style sword, and then in the other extreme over-exaggerate the effectiveness of the curved sword, where a curved sword, right, cutting through a chunk of wood like that, like so much depends on the type of wood, like genuinely.
It works.
If it's actually a real, if it's not dense and somewhat light, right, you could potentially cut through something like that with what they show in the film. See how far it'll sink in on a cut like this. Ready? Holy crap! That wouldn't be the best type of wood to make a pike formation or palisade, what they seem to be doing in the film. Right? You could assume that it's got at least enough structural strength to achieve what it's supposed to be doing in the film, which would mean, I'm sorry, even like good cutting curved swords are not going to be getting through that type of wood. And so overall, it does paint a very biased and inaccurate picture, which is unfortunate because it's a great fun film. And even the scenes are fun, where you know, the sword being too heavy and the guy just says, you know, get stronger. It's a funny kind of quirky line where it's like, yeah, deal with it, right? And the scene where he comes back with the curved sword and he does the moves and the guy responds like, when you die, can I give that to my daughter?
When you die, can I give that to my daughter?
They're funny lines. I think it could still have achieved those moments without grossly misrepresenting how these swords actually operate in the real world. Because here's another kind of misconception. Most of those, you know, Viking warriors are using swords in the film. Swords are a much more prestigious, valuable, expensive weapon for that period specifically. They were around, but most of those Vikings would be using axes or spears. So there's that. And instead of depicting the swords as these crude, overly heavy, brutish things, there were some swords in that period, Viking, you know, culture made, as well as others, that were unbelievably beautiful. They have found ones that had insane pattern welding on the blade, which just would have looked immaculate, let alone the Ulfbert blades, which are made out of high carbon steel. Really good quality high carbon steel. And so I actually think in certain instances, this you know, Arabian man who has come to this new culture should actually be looking at some of these Viking swords, these sverds, right? Sverd, I'm bad at the pronunciation. But being amazed at the quality of them. Because some of those swords in that period were unbelievably amazing. Incredibly so. And it would have been cool if he was actually shows appreciation, like, wow, this is a good sword, and you know, he adopts it and starts to use it and learn the styles with the shield combat. That's my own preference. What do you guys think? How do you think it should have been done? Do you like the film? What are some gross misconceptions that you have seen about swords that have been depicted in popular films? Let me know in the comments below. I actually do want to see what some of those, you know, comments and suggestions are, because maybe if you suggest a good one that I haven't thought of, I could make a video like this discussing it. And if you like these types of videos where I discuss swords in either films, pop culture, fantasy, loads of content here on Shadowversity doing that. In fact, why don't you check out me talking about a fantasy-style sword from a really great epic fantasy book series, the Stormlight Archives, where I discuss the Shard Blades. It's right there, and there are some really surprising qualities about those swords. So check it out, and until that time, farewell.